Welcome to the panel discussion, 50 Years of Walt Disney World, Florida BD before Disney and AD after Disney. It's being presented as part of the Florida Historical Society 2021 Virtual Public History Forum. On October 25, 1965, Florida Governor Hayden Burns ended the excited speculation about who was quietly buying up large pieces of property south of Orlando and what they were planning to build there. Governor Burns praised the plans for Walt Disney World, calling it the greatest attraction in the history of Florida. Legendary Florida folk musician Frank Thomas was known for his songs about Florida history and culture, and could trace his Florida roots back to the mid-1800s. He referred to the theme parks as Dismal World and the Tragic Kingdom. Wherever you fall on the spectrum of opinions about Walt Disney World, from Frank Thomas to Governor Burns or somewhere in between, it's undeniable that when Walt Disney World opened 50 years ago in the fall of 1971, it had a significant impact on Florida in many ways and continues to do so. I'm Ben Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society, and I'll be moderating today's conversation, 50 Years of Walt Disney World. I'm producer and host of Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society, and the public television series, Florida Frontiers. My books include Beyond the Theme Parks, Exploring Central Florida, published by University Press of Florida. And I'm pleased to introduce our very distinguished panel today. Rick Foglesong is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Rollins College in Winter Park, where he taught courses on national politics, urban politics, and urban policy. He was the political analyst for WFTV Channel 9, the ABC affiliate in Orlando. His books include Married to the Mouse, Walt Disney World and Orlando, published by Yale University Press. Cher is a professor at Emerson College in Boston, Massachusetts, where she is an art historian focused on modern and contemporary art and architecture. She's a specialist in public art and museum studies. Her books include Power and Paradise in Walt Disney's World, published by the University Press of Florida. Francina Boykin is president of the Apopka Historical Society, a founding member of the Democracy Forum's Ocoee Research Project, and a lifelong resident of Central Florida. She's been featured in film documentaries and numerous discussions about the Ocoee Massacre, race relations, and civil rights. Jim Clark is senior lecturer in the history department at the University of Central Florida. His books include A History Lover's Guide to Florida and Orlando, Florida, A Brief History, published by the History Press, and Presidents in Florida, published by Pineapple Press. His work for television includes writing and producing the recent documentary, Presidents in Florida. Welcome, all of you, and thank you for being part of this panel today. I think it's important for us, appropriate for us, to begin with each of us describing our personal experiences with Disney World and how they help to inform our perspectives. And I'll get us started. My family actually went to Walt Disney World the very first year that it opened. We came down in 1972. I was 9 years old, and of course I was the perfect target audience for them. And I had a great time, of course. I remember the haunted house and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and interacting with the characters. So I had a very good first impression, and we continued to come during the 1970s on vacation. My family moved to Florida in 1978, and as people would come visit us from out of state, of course, we'd take them to Disney World and the other theme parks. Before I graduated from Winter Park High School in 1981, I'd had a chance to perform at the park. Our school chorus was part of the Candlelight Processional that was a whole lot of fun. We got it felt very like you were part of something special, but the behind the scenes part of Disney that nobody sees, and getting all lined up, all the choir members, and walking through a door that was hidden, from the rest of the park, and just entering the park from behind the scenes. It was really quite something. And the pop ensemble from Winter Park High School that I was in had a chance to perform in Lake Buena Vista. And later, when I was in the Camerata Chorus of Orlando Opera Company from the mid-'80s through the '90s, we also got to perform at the park. So I had some really good experiences there. Uh, in the 1990s, late 80s, and 1990s, I had my first full-time job as a producer and host of a public radio program called The Arts Connection on 90.7 WMFE. And for a good amount of time, anytime that Walt Disney World or their affiliated parks opened a new ride or an ancillary park, they would provide free passes to media. And this became frowned upon later, but particularly in the early 90s, it wasn't a big deal, and it didn't. Obviously, they were trying to encourage positive coverage of Walt Disney World from the media, but it didn't. Walt Disney World hardly ever appeared on my program at the time, except if it had a legitimate arts and cultural aspect, like Riverdance. I remember covering that when it came to Walt Disney World, for example. But it was a very positive experience. Again, kind of a behind the scenes, a special. You could stay at their hotels and have these great receptions, experiences that I probably couldn't pay for at the time and wouldn't, pay for. But that was also a great experience. But as I continued doing my radio program and continuing my education and doing my graduate studies at Rollins College and then later Union Institute and University, my focus became on local history. And I started to realize that a lot of people came to Orlando. They would fly into Orlando International Airport and take a Disney shuttle to Disney property, go to the theme parks, get back on a Disney shuttle from their Disney hotel and go back to the airport and feel like they had visited Florida. And of course, there's a lot more to Florida than the theme parks. And so that became a focus of my work, documenting our local history with the hope that tourists would be encouraged, and also people who live here. There's a lot of people who moved to Florida, Central Florida in particular, and they still call someplace else home. They raise families here, they have careers here, they live here for decades, and Cincinnati or Chicago or someplace else is still home. And I felt that if they learned about local history and culture, that perhaps that could add to a sense of community. But again, for these tourists to realize there's other things to do if they venture off of Walt Disney World property. So I wrote my first book, Beyond the Theme Parks, Exploring Central Florida, which was published by University of Florida Press. And each chapter is a different town in the Central Florida area, tells the history of each community, but also things you can go and enjoy today. Historic sites, events tied to local history, that sort of thing. So I still see the positive side of Disney, but I also live here, and I have to drive in the traffic, and there are ancillary problems that we'll talk about with Walt Disney World for locals, but again, had some very positive experiences with Disney as well, particularly growing up. Now, Cher and I, like me, I know you first encountered Disney World as a child, right?
Yes, I was 8 and my parents took me on a family vacation. I grew up right outside of Manhattan in northern New Jersey. So, very urban environment. Just Florida itself seemed so different from our daily lives. The weather was so nice, but it was just, it felt like a real break from daily routine. And then once you got in the park, that's where you could feel it. And at that time, of course, it was only the Magic Kingdom that was in existence as the Florida theme park. And I was completely entranced. And my family had returned many times over the years. And we wound up having family friends living down there that we would visit, and we would see the parks then as well. And I honestly got to the point where I'd been so many times that I stopped counting. And so as I got older, I was still really kind of enchanted by the parks, but I also started to see these things, like these kind of critical hesitations I had, things that felt troubling about it. And as I eventually became an academic, I was noticing as I got more drawn to pursuing this as a topic that for me, what was really problematic is there were essentially, and this is simplifying it, but it was very much true, I think, especially about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that it was as if there were two camps writing about Disney. There were people who were writing under the auspices of the Disney company, and those were completely laudatory, not critical in any way. And even if they had helpful things to say, it was all through the rosiest pair of glasses, but they got access to the archives and all the resources. And then there were academics often, which technically are my colleagues, but I didn't necessarily feel in sympathy with the way they approached it, because a lot of them were very proud of having never gone to the parks or having stepped foot on them, and in fact felt very comfortable criticizing them. And to me, neither of those positions were particularly envious, because I felt the most interesting, most accurate, and maybe most radical position was the gray stuff in the middle, because there were really enchanting, interesting, engaging things happening at the parks. And at the same time, there were these troubling aspects as well, and when we dig into, Walt Disney's history as a man and the, aspects of the Disney company historically, we can see those troubling aspects. And so for me, it was like, can I retain my, some level of enthusiasm for what works, but also feel like I could really critique what I felt was a problem, or what, especially I think now through the lens of social justice, there are questions that should have been asked of Disney and were, but it not in the same persistent way a long time ago, that are now being reframed and asked differently. So that's kind of what brought me there. And I would say that I remain kind of that person who has enthusiasm, and yet, I'm not just looking through the rosy colored glasses. I try to see it in its totality. And those complications enrich it, but also at times there are some things that are really hard to swallow, and those are the areas where we need to push back.
Great. Rick Foglesong, how about you? Tell us your personal association with Disney or discovery, and how your perspective has changed over time, if it has.
Well, I guess I know which of the two categories Cher mentioned I belong in. In fact, a friend of mine, an attorney in Washington, was at a bar association meeting not long after my book came out, my book on Disney in 2000. And he encountered two Disney attorneys, mentioned my name to them, and they said, "Don't talk to him." I don't know why they said that. And told the story that as a child, I had a bad experience at a Disney theme park, and that it had warped me. Actually, that's not true. I did not visit a Disney park until I came to Orlando in the mid-1980s, and had the experience then of seeing it through the eyes of my children, who were 2 and 7. And when we had moved from Western Massachusetts to Orlando, I was able to tell them, we're going to move to Disney World. Was able to use what became then a classic line. I've been fascinated by Disney as a student of urban planning, having previously written a history of urban planning, and was intrigued from the beginning with the ways in which Disney designed a model urban community, not the one they said they were going to build, but one that has been influential nonetheless. And when I discovered after coming here that the Disney company also had its own private government, a sort of Vatican with mouse ears, I've called it, I was really intrigued as the political scientist to know what happens when you give public powers to a private business corporation. And that's something I enjoyed learning about and writing about.
Well, Francina, Boykin, you've lived here your whole life. Tell me a little bit about your personal association with Disney.
Well, life was very simple for a native Floridian like myself in the 1950s, when I would rush home every day to watch the Mouseketeers. My favorite Mouseketeer was Annette, and it would be later years. In 1971, I was a student at Valencia Community College, as it was then, and a staffer at Valencia had asked that I was chosen, rather, to go on an interview for a job as a tour guide. And at Walt Disney World, it didn't really sink in as to the magnitude of what Walt Disney World was all about. I went for the interview at the preview center and saw all the models and what was going to take place. And it still didn't sink in, because I grew up out in Northwest Orange County in Apopka, wherein the only thing we knew about recreation would be running through the woods or going to Rock Springs on a hot day to float down the streams. And so after the interview for the position as a tour guide, which I did not get, I later was hired at Walt Disney World as a hostess in Sara Lee's Bakery. That was in 1971. I have watched the changes come and how it has impacted, many of us, especially locals like myself, because I love green. I love to see the greenery and I love my environment. And the changes that Disney has brought, it got to a point where, I wouldn't even want to tell people I lived in the area because, we had a lot of friends from the north who were like, oh, I'm coming. Can you get me tickets? And, it just changed the dynamics of the entire area, that which I was familiar with. And I worked at Disney probably for about 2 weeks. And I just couldn't take the drive because in the 70s, it was a long, dark drive. And if you worked at night, and I was a student at Valencia at the time, it got to be a little bit too much. So I didn't continue working there, but have watched through the years the growth and the impact. And, every time I fly north, or travel back north is to see the kids with the Mickey Mouse ears. And I kid, well, I know where you've been. And they start smiling. I said, you've been to Disney. How did you know? I'm like, well, you're wearing your Mickey Mouse ears. So internationally, Disney, because people in my community, the economics of it, because many worked in the farm. And to get a job in Disney in any capacity was a big move for a lot of people because now you would have jobs with benefits. And I have a lot of friends and neighbors who have retired with great retirement packages. And so, it had its very positive place in Central Florida. And also I learned during my research that Walt Disney first did his planning sessions in Ocoee at the Colony Hotel. And unbeknown to him, and probably like myself, did not know what had happened there, but the Colony Hotel was a major place for people because of his location near the Florida Turnpike. So yeah, it changed my life positively, I would say Disney did.
Okay, thank you. James Clark, how about you? And your
my experience, I moved here in 76 from the north, and I was a journalist when I first came here with the newspaper. And Ben, you and Francine both mentioned free tickets. That's one of my memories, is friends and relatives assuming I could get free tickets and calling and somehow getting angry when I'd say, no, they always assumed I was lying, that I had this stack of free tickets on my desk and I just wouldn't share with them. I don't know if you all had the same kinds of experiences. Also, Francine mentioned working in the Sara Lee Pavilion. That was the Disney that I remembered. I went to Disneyland as a very small child when it almost first opened, and all the pavilions were sponsored. It's kind of interesting what's happened to, Kodak and General Electric. You mentioned Sara Lee. Everything, and Rick probably can talk to this better, but everything had a name on it when I first went there. And I've also been kind of amazed at the growth of this animal. When they originally bought the land, 25,000 acres, Walt's brother Roy argued against it and said, hey, why are we buying so much land here? And Walt said, don't you wish we had bought this much land in Anaheim? And 25,000 acres seemed like half the state. And Now they're buying more land out there and developing more land. So this really has become something I'm not even sure Walt imagined 50 years ago.
Well, Rick Foglesong, Florida and Central Florida in particular was a much different place in the decades before and after Disney arrived. What were some of the differences in the urban landscape pre and post Disney?
Well, the Disney company first looked at Ocala as the site for what they called their East Coast Disneyland. They chose Orlando over Ocala because we had better road linkages. And you could argue that Orlando might be Ocala or a place like it, or maybe Lakeland had Disney not come. I might focus my remarks on the economy then and now. At the time when Disney came, Orlando had an economy that was a two-legged stool, a term, a metaphor often used. It had citrus and it had the military with the presence of the Martin Company here and the U.S. Missile Test Center, Cape Canaveral. Those had their problems. Freezes would burn the citrus crops, and the military industry, military industrial complex, if you will, was subject to budget problems from time to time. And so there was a hope on the part of local leaders that they could bring a third industry to this area that would give us a three-legged stool. And they got that for a while with Disney World, in that they brought a new industry, tourism, to this area. And tourism had never been in the central part of the state. The tourism industry had always been concentrated on the coast. But Walt Disney invented something, the theme park, that attracted people to a man-made environment, not just the beach and the water that had historically attracted people. I think but for Disney coming here, had they never come, we would not have a tourism-based economy now. I don't think that ever would have happened, because I think people would have continued to come to Florida for the same historical reasons, for the beach, for the water, for the climate. So Walt Disney changed all that, and maybe a little bit later on, I'll talk about the ways in which today our economy is imbalanced because of our over-reliance upon Disney and tourism.
Now, Jim Clark, before Disney arrived, the huge property that Disney now owns was mostly undeveloped. Some of it was used for hunting and fishing, including by a U.S. president, right?
Yeah, the odd thing to me has been that in 1883, Chester A. Arthur becomes the first president to come to Florida. No president had ever come here. And he wants to go fishing. And he goes down to Kissimmee with his party. And he assumes everybody is going to go fishing. But everybody else in the party says, no, we found this new thing where they're going to take us out on Lake Toho and let us shoot alligators. And of course, these folks had never seen an alligator. Arthur said he wanted to go fishing, and a guide recommended a little creek to him, and he pronounced it the greatest place in the world for fishing. And 60 years later, Walt Disney comes to that same creek, Reedy Creek, and on the banks of Reedy Creek builds Walt Disney World. In fact, as Rick pointed out, it has its own government called the Reedy Creek Improvement District.
True, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. And please feel free to chime in if anybody has additional things to say. But Francina, Boykin, I wanted to ask you, prior to the arrival of Disney, there were some firmly established African-American towns and communities in the Central Florida area. And you mentioned the impact of providing jobs, perhaps better jobs, even if they were, lower wage tourism jobs, better jobs than the community could get elsewhere. Were there other impacts that Walt Disney World had when it initially opened on the African-American communities in Central Florida?
Well, in a very positive sense, as far as the opportunities for employment, the impact in communities like Northwest, Orange County, Apopka, Zellwood, Tangerine, those small communities, which most of the labor force had been in agriculture and domestic workers. For example, many Black women who worked as maids in the homes of white families, they left those jobs, and one or two got hired, and they talked about the great experiences of working at Walt Disney. So you had many of these people abandon those type of positions, which was a very significant impact as far as the betterment. I mentioned because in the farms, and you had a lot of issues on the farms, with hard labor and the conditions. I mean, to be able to drive to the Magic Kingdom on a daily basis and not have to deal with the elements, because they mentioned the freezes that happen with the orange groves. Myself, I worked, picking beans and oranges when, that was the only employment that was available, for young people during that time. And my father, for example, worked at Minute Maid juice plant. Those were better jobs, working in that aspect and packing houses and what have you. But Disney, many of my neighbors, they would carpool to the jobs, at Walt Disney World. And plus they had the opportunity during that time to get the free tickets and share with family. And, it was really, life was great. If you were connected in Walt Disney, the problem with me was getting there, driving through the long winding roads, the back roads, we called them, through Winter Garden to go into the back entrance to Reams Road where the employees would enter. But, carpooling was a big thing. And I recall I left the area in 1972 to attend University of North Florida. And when I returned, it was like in 1981, I could not believe, the greater impact Disney had in those 10 years that I had moved away, that, the opportunities and the growth, the new subdivisions, and, it was just a lot to comprehend, if that's the proper term to use.
Well, Cher Knight, there's an apocryphal story about Walt Disney's brother Roy going to one of the first theme parks in Florida, Cypress Gardens, and supposedly being so impressed with it that he called Walt up on the phone and told him that he needed to investigate coming to Florida to build a new theme park empire. What was it that attracted Walt Disney to Florida to build this new theme park?
That's such a great question, Ben. And I think to even go back to something Rick was saying earlier, to really kind of put a framework around it or highlight it, it was so important to Disney. They weren't building an amusement park. They were building a theme park. It was a really new type. And part of it came out of, we know it was pretty well documented that he would have these daddy-daughter days with his daughters growing up and look for amusements and places to take them. And he was always kind of discouraged by what he found. He found them kind of down at the heels and they weren't clean, and the entertainments always didn't seem savory to him. And when he wanted to build Disney, when he, the Disney parks and was envisioning them, and his wife and other people would kind of press him on this. Why? Those places are so dirty and messy. He said, yes, but mine wouldn't be. And so I think he already had a very visionary aspect. And then there was this desire to build on the East Coast, as we know for sure. And of course, he had been very involved in the 1964-65 World's Fair held in Flushing Meadows, Queens. And that gave him an amazing opportunity to essentially use other people's money to develop technologies and attractions that he would later deploy in the park. So animatronics, right, came largely through working on the audio animatronic figure of Abraham Lincoln, or working, for example, on the Carousel of Progress, or working, for example, on It's a Small World After All. After that fair was done, or as it was coming to an end, Robert Moses, who was then the kind of the commissioner and working also as a parks director essentially for New York City, had kind of approached him about the idea of using the fairgrounds for the East Coast Park. And he seemed to understand immediately, instinctively, two things. One, wasn't going to be big enough. And two, wasn't going to be warm enough. So he wanted to have, a kind of a more seasonless or temperate climate that would welcome people year round, where you could operate the business year round. And as I think Jim was mentioning earlier, and I very much agree, when I've written about this, I've dealt really specifically with the Florida park, because he was so disappointed with not having enough of a buffer zone and enough of a level of control in Anaheim. And so I think that Florida gave them all these opportunities. It was this seasonal climate. People were used to going there for tourism, as Rick said, though not necessarily to Central Florida. And, a lot of the tourism that they engaged in was either going to the beach or going to like Gatorland or Cypress Gardens, something like that, which may have tried to theme, but on a very small, modest scale. And so Central Florida allowed for a grandiose vision, grandiose scale, ample land, and this climate that, from a socioeconomic standpoint as a business was going to serve them really well.
And Rick Foglesong, the Disney Corporation actually formed their own government in Florida. Tell us about the Reedy Creek Improvement District.
Well, Cher teased up this comment because the Disney company did not like what had happened in California around Disneyland. They only bought 230 acres there, and so they couldn't control their periphery. And there were two things that they wanted when they came to Florida. One was a green belt surrounding the built-up park. So that meant they wanted to buy a lot more land than they had bought in California. And the second was that they wanted to have their own private government, because in Anaheim, California, they didn't control the government. They had political influence, but they didn't control what it did, and they didn't like its growth controls or lack of growth controls. And so here they wanted to have a government that they could control. The key to the success of Disney World, I think, is, well, first, creativity. Okay, let's give the Disney company credit there. But second, that they wanted that buffer surrounding them. And therefore, they got privatization, to use a modern term, where government would rely on a private business in order to provide public services. And the second was deregulation, that they could provide their own building inspectors, that they would be immune to external zoning. That was really key to them. One of the drawbacks of the Central Florida location was that Orange County had recently, when they came, adopted a comprehensive zoning ordinance, and that scared them. They wanted immunity from that. And so they told the state of Florida that they were going to build a city, a going city, where 20,000 people would live and work and play. And in order to make that work, they would need privatization, where they could provide public services under themselves, and they would need deregulation, that is to control the kind of regulations that local government normally provides. And they got that. And to go on just a little bit more, what that did really was to concretize in time the unequal bargaining relationship between the Disney company and the surrounding governments. It was an unequal relationship at the time because Disney was a big deal, and Florida was not yet that attractive a place to live and do business. And so Florida threw a lot of blandishments at the Disney company, gave them everything that they wanted, And the result is that when you fast forward 50 years, guess what? They still have those controls over their own destiny, something that I'm sure the Universal Company theme park that they would like to have, that other Florida developers would like to have, but they don't have it. And that's one of the ways in which the Disney company has been able to control their own fate and become this 10,000-pound gorilla that dominates Central Florida politics and to some large extent, Florida politics as well.
And the Reedy Creek Improvement District, they haven't done it, of course, but they still have the right, don't they, to build their own airport and a nuclear power plant if they wanted to, right?
Well, that's right. They're still subject to federal regulation. But as far as state law is concerned, they have that power. And by the way, any other company that bought their land, you go back 10 years, Comcast was talking about a leveraged buyout of the Disney company. Then Comcast, a company with less of a public name, would own that land. And if they own the land, then they would control the government as well, and they could use it as they chose. Or they could divide up the land to maybe a no-name kind of companies that wouldn't have the same public image concerns that the Disney company has. And that's one of the Achilles heels of the Disney company that has motivated them to be somewhat responsible over the years, less bad stories be written about them in the national or international media, and thereby harm that important public image that they have, favorable public image that they have to some very large extent.
Well, Jim Clark, I mentioned the secrecy surrounding the acquisition of property in Florida until the official announcement was made in 1965. There was some pretty wild speculation about what was going on, then what was being built on the property and by whom, right?
Yeah, there were wild rumors. The Sentinel had, the Orlando Sentinel had assigned a reporter to try to track down who was buying all this land. Everybody knew something was happening. Nobody knew exactly what it was. The funniest one was, remember, this is 1964, that era, and 63, 64. And Ford Motor Company had just introduced its new car, the Mustang, and somebody sent a telegram to the Sentinel saying that Ford was buying the property for its to build for Mustangs, and the Sentinel went with it, and they had a big story about Ford Motor Company, and the next day or the day after, whoever the prankster was sent another telegram saying, yes, Ford wanted to grow hay to feed its Mustangs, but the Sentinel had gone for the prank. Hercules Powder Company was mentioned prominently. One of the Disney executives, this was weird, Disney would not let people fly from California to Orlando, lest they tip people off. So you had to book an intermediate flight. One of the executives had a mother in St. Louis, so he would fly to St. Louis, spend some time with his mom, and then fly on to Orlando. So the Sentinel got word that this executive was flying from St. Louis. It started the rumor that it was McDonnell Douglas, the aircraft company, which made sense because what's now Lockheed Martin was already here.
Interesting. And actually, Walt Disney was looking at St. Louis at one point, I believe.
Yes,
but then
he met with Augie Bush at one point, and Rick knows more about this than I do. It goes through several versions, but Walt at one point was looking for perhaps a downtown location, a totally different concept.
they tried to nod toward diversity at the theme park right off the bat with the It's a Small World ride. But Francina, Boykin, Walt Disney World acknowledges that they've had trouble with diversity and their racial representation over the years. What are your thoughts on how Disney has dealt with race and diversity in their product?
Well, they have come a very long ways because in the early on, for example, the position I had was interviewed for a tour guide. My skin tone was not light enough, and not wanting to have persons of color or darker complexion working in the public specter of Disney really, well, growing up, I know my place. I've always tell people, don't forget where I come from, and I know where I am. And when I discovered I did not get the job as a tour guide because I was not what Disney was looking for then, to leave the area and return 10 years later, I was almost in shock, to see the various shades, skin tones of people of color, working in the different capacities at Walt Disney. So they have, they were more or less like a work in progress as far as, because you had affirmative action during that period. I think it was Bob Billingsley, who just recently passed away. He was one of the major recruiters of people from, people of color, if you want to put it that way. And I worked with a group of Haitian immigrants who had come to the country, and their dream was to work at Walt Disney. And I was like, okay, this was the early 80s. And I'm like, okay, well, I hope it can happen. But now, they brought in trainers to teach English as a second language, not just for, the Haitian community, but, other minorities. So to see, I have had friends who have retired from executive positions from Walt Disney. So, post civil rights and the birth of Walt Disney during that time, and being a worldwide tourist attraction, they had to change their format as far as employing people of color.
Could I just interject for a moment? I was just thinking while Francina was speaking, also, a lot of times it's downplayed or glossed over, but the Disney Corporation in many ways was a leader in providing rights for people in the LGBTQ community. They were some of the first to give partner rights. And so, sometimes when there have been communities that have been historically marginalized, and they have had, there are kind of expectations or assumptions about their treatment under the Disney Corporation, and sometimes it's been very different. And so it's been in particular people, who are part of the queer community who have been very appreciative and have pointed to that in other employment circumstances or civil rights circumstances as opportunities, for example, to get partner benefits or to feel that they have workplace protections that they wouldn't normally be afforded, and to reassert their civil rights. So I think it's just important to interject that too, because Disney gets things wrong, absolutely, sometimes, but they also have gotten things right. And I think they have been much more aware. And even recently, I know that some of the films that had really very, in many people's, estimation, kind of questionable content regarding, what I'd say many of us would just say was racist. They've now been reissuing those with statements. So there's an awareness. I'm not saying there isn't still work to be done, but there is an awareness, a sensitivity. And I just think that that's an important part of kind of hearing what Francina is talking about, and then thinking about, well, what's the legacy from those kinds of things? What comes next?
If I may, for my money, the problems associated with Disney and tourism have more to do with class than they do with race.
Yeah.
The problem with our over-reliance on tourism is that it's associated, at least in the Florida case, I'll come back to that, in the Florida case, with low wages. We have a smaller percentage of jobs in manufacturing today in 2021 than we did in the 1980s and 1990s. Only Las Vegas in the United States has more reliance on the social retail services and the social economy, service economy, I mean to say. Now, service work is not inherently low wage. If you look at California in the movie industry and entertainment, if you look at Las Vegas, you find high wage jobs that are part of the service sector. The difference, in a word, is labor unions. Florida is a right to work state, very difficult to organize the labor union in this state. In the case of California, in the entertainment industry, heavily unionized. In the case of Las Vegas, heavily unionized. There, someone can work in tourism and entertainment and have a living family wage, but not here in Florida at Disney World. So that's the challenge, I think, for Central Florida, is to move on up the ladder of economic evolution to produce higher value added products where we're not so reliant upon tourism. But just quickly here, there's a saying among some economic historians about path dependence, that where you start from in economic evolution depends upon determines where you can get to. And some places you can't get to from where you start. And that's the question, whether Central Florida can evolve beyond tourism or not. I think the record of the last 20 years suggests that we may be stuck with Disney and tourism.
And, Walt Disney has created their own separate world, as we were talking about, but they have had, of course, a significant impact on the world outside, as you're just talking about the economy for people working there. But they've also generated traffic issues and other things that you've written about besides this low wage economy. The traffic, for example, I-4 did Orlando, as I recall, and Orange County actually helped pay for additional exits to the park, and it's not even in those areas, right?
Well, that's right. Low wages is related to traffic congestion and also to the affordable housing challenge that we have. Because of low wages, Disney employees have to drive farther north, south, and west in order to find affordable housing. So that means they're on the roads for a longer period of time, that to find housing that matches their wage level. That's the challenge that we face. Now, we do have a bed tax here in Florida. With Disney's influence, the state, when it was looking for another source of income to support tourism, decided on a bed tax, so-called, that applies to hotels, not theme park admission tickets, but rather to hotels. And the problem is that that tax, the proceeds, can only be used to support tourism, not to support public schools, not to support highways. In Nevada, it's different. There, in the Las Vegas case, the most relevant example, the proceeds of their tourist tax can be used to support schools and transportation. In my humble opinion, that's the political challenge here in Central Florida and through the state legislature, is to expand the permissible uses of the tourist tax to benefit not just the tourism industry, but to benefit those of us who live here and cope with the affordable housing and traffic congestion challenges that we have.
Francina, Boykin, as Cher was talking about a moment ago, Disney is aware of its representation issues and is dealing with it. But can you address a little bit why that representation is important? I mean, we've come a long way from Song of the South to, Princesses of Color. Why is that important?
It's important because, what we has become, our country has become, as far as, representation from every community. Oftentimes I think about, when Walt Disney introduced his plans to our forefathers or those people who were in government at that time, they might have thought, he must have been high on something that he was bringing this big, huge park to this area. It was like putting the cart before the horse. With, we talk about the roads, we talk about diversity and employment. I mean, to come and tell the locals that, we're going to make you the vacation kingdom of the world. Even myself as a local could not actually comprehend or have that foresight to see where we are now, with our roadways, with housing. I mean, everywhere is crowded out pretty much, and it's not going to get any better. So, having that representation is a reflection of, what you say you are, and you are, a family-oriented attraction, because all the attraction I knew when I was growing up in Central Florida, where we would go is like Six Gun Territory, Cypress Gardens, or the Central Florida Zoo. And, even doing that was during the Jim Crow times, and, with separate bathrooms or separate. I mean, we have come a long ways. And I think Walt Disney World as a whole, when you started going from shutting down your town at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, like we used to in Apopka, to businesses staying open 24/7. Oh my goodness. It's quite a change. And so we as people have to adapt to that as well, or we have.
And Jim, yeah, Francina makes an important point there, but there was, Central Florida was a much different place as far as race relations go, right?
Yes, Francina touched on this and share some. The year Walt Disney World opened, the sheriff of Orange County was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. The number one attraction, as you and Rick will remember, was a big tree right outside Orlando called the Senator. It seems impossible today to imagine the sheriff of Orange County belonging to the Ku Klux Klan, or thousands and hundreds of thousands of people going to see a big tree every year. But that was what it was like. And Rick is absolutely correct. We have given so much to the attractions and have not demanded enough in return. We're handing out 125 million in highway money to Universal Studios. They're giving some low-cost housing, but not nearly enough. These are large companies that have lots of money, and over the years, they could have done a lot more.
And before we run out of time, Jim, I want to mention that Disney World, of course, attracts visitors from around the world, but you've covered a lot of presidents who are associated with Walt Disney World. If you could tell us a little bit about some of the significant visits by U.S. presidents that have been associated with Disney.
Yeah, presidents love to have that backdrop. Jimmy Carter came early for Epcot. Two of the three presidents I always liked. One was President Obama, who had the best line when he came to Disney World and met Mickey Mouse. He said it was a pleasure to be anywhere with someone who had bigger ears than him, which I thought was a great comment. Two people who came here gave probably their most famous lines. Richard Nixon, speaking at the Contemporary Hotel, said, "I am not a crook." Perhaps his most famous line, which turned out to be not true. And Ronald Reagan, who visited Disney and then spoke nearby at a hotel, gave his Evil Empire speech. So presidents have come for fun and to make serious points.
And Cher, Knight, as we look back at 50 years of Walt Disney World, where do you think the corporation should go from here, as far as Central Florida goes, from your viewpoint?
Yeah, that's another good question, Ben. I think the pandemic has just changed the notion of what it constitutes business as usual or what it will be in the future for all of us. And I do believe that people will come back to the theme parks, and Disney is going to try to figure that out. But it was a multinational corporation before this, and it will remain so afterwards. And they seem to be very prescient in the idea of the diversification of media and a synergistic use of media, that you're constantly reinforcing your other products and ideas. I think the success of Disney Plus streaming has been phenomenal. I think it would have done well anyway, because they have, franchises like Star Wars, for example, that has a built-in massive audience that kind of multiplies the Disney enthusiasts. But the confluence of that with the pandemic and the rise in the use of streaming services has been exponentially beyond anything I think Disney or others really imagined at this point. And I think it does point to future directions, that we're going to continue to see a diversification in terms of media, global reach, but the formula, I think, will be the same, this kind of synergistic approach, that there's this holistic network of television shows and streaming and theme parks and books and clothing and toys. And in a way, they all kind of refer back to each other and sell each other. But also, I think because they have acquired franchises like Star Wars, there was kind of an understanding that although Disney proper has its devotees and enthusiasts, that they needed to kind of diversify the content, right? So that there could be other folks who maybe wouldn't come to the parks or come over and over again as repeat visitors without feeling there was new content to explore. And I think that we're going to see a continuation of the diversification of content and a diversification of media. And I think Disney Plus has worked for them. I think they had an idea that it was going to go well. I don't think anyone knew it was going to go this well. And of course, we'll never know how well the launch would have gone without having the pandemic's circumstances impact it. But it certainly has become, it's more than a litmus test now, right? And so I think it becomes a roadmap for the next phase of that business plan.
Ben, I'd like the credit that Cher gives to the Disney company for the way in which at the parks they've handled the pandemic crisis. American cities were the first cities in world history to be built under the conditions of capitalism and democracy, for better and for worse. Capitalism and democracy, they fragment power. What Disney cities, I'm talking about their theme parks, what they have going for them is that Disney owns everything. And in the Florida case, it also controls the government. And that has enabled them to coordinate things and to create an urban environment that works. And when the crisis of the COVID epidemic came, they were able to handle it in a way in which the state of Florida more generally, arguably, and a lot of other cities and states were not, because they didn't have that centralization of authority to address the common good.
Well, thank you. And thanks to each of you for participating. I think we've covered a lot of good ground here. And I want to thank Rick Foglesong and Cher Knight and Francina Boykin and Jim Clark for participating in this panel, 50 Years of Walt Disney World, Florida BD before Disney and AD after Disney. And I'm sure that we probably all won't be around in another 50 years, but I'm sure Disney will be. So hopefully somebody will still be talking about them. Thank you very much for being here, and thanks for those watching for joining us.